Welcome to AP Euro for Winners.
Today, we are continuing Unit 5 and discussing the French Revolution. And we need you to know how much College Board loves this topic. A lot of LAQs or TBQs are going to come back to this, so please make sure you really take the time and understand the French Revolution and what's going on. Also, look at this picture on the right of the seal. We are definitely going to be circling back around to it. So let's go over some causes, aka context, for the French Revolution. The first one is this influence of Enlightenment ideas. And we know what the Enlightenment is, but we have these philosophers spreading their ideas, becoming more popular. More French people are reading their ideas. We've got things like natural rights, liberty, equality, and fraternity, specifically in France, are being spread around. Montesquieu's Spirit of Laws is going to promote the idea of checks and balances within the government. Rousseau's social contract theory is going to talk about how government is based on agreements of people, giving up some rights for them in agreement to be protected by the government. But we're going to see how all this manifests throughout the revolution.
Right, another cause of the French Revolution is the imbalance of the Estates General. So, if you remember, I think we've talked about the Estates General before. So, it's basically the representative body of France. You can think of this like America's Congress or the Parliament in England. And each of these estates has one vote. And we're talking how there's an imbalance here. So, there are the three estates. The first estate is the clergy. This is about 1% of the people. The second estate is the nobility. This is about 2% of the people. And remember, the nobility are protected by their birthright. So goes back to feudal times, and they still have this protection of the fact that just because they were born into being a noble, they are noble. Okay, so some examples of their privileges, like only nobles are allowed to hunt in like the king's woods and stuff like that. And then the third estate is everybody else. So that's all the commoners, all the regular people. That's 97% of the people. There's so just to really break it down for you, there's 500,000 people in the first and second estate, and there's 23 million people in the third estate, and they each have an equal say in the government, right? So there's a big imbalance of power here. 3% of the population are going to decide for the other 97%. I'm not great at math, don't tell my wife, but this is not very fair. All right. So the third estate has no way of changing or improving their circumstances because these people, being the average citizens of France, they obviously want more power to be able to improve their life. Okay. And the other idea is that a lot of their anger is going to be fueled by a pamphlet that's produced by this guy named Sieyès, and it's called "What is the Third Estate?" And it gets circulated around. I think of this like Luther's 95 Theses, right? So it's like a pamphlet that gets circulated around. People are reading it. It's making an influence. All right. So what's this pamphlet say? It says that the first and second estates are parasites. They're sucking the lifeblood out of the third estate.
That imagery, imagine that.
Yeah, and it argues that without the third estate, that the nation wouldn't exist. Because if we think about it, 97% of the people, they're the ones doing all like the farming and the working and the cottage industries and all that kind of stuff, right? So the third estate is the ones that are necessary for the state to function. And the pamphlet's going to gain a lot of popularity because of the Enlightenment, because of the printing press, and the members of the third estate are going to feel like that they have some more power after they read this, that they're kind of inspired to do something.
And I want you to know it's not just the third estate. There are some members of the first and second estate that are enlightened and that are embracing these concepts. But again, the majority of the first and second are not. All right, and the third and final cause of the French Revolution is economic crisis. So we've gone over a little bit of this before, but France right now is in a lot of debt. Think back to King Louis XIV, right? Pictured over there with the legs on the right. He was an absolutist ruler. This goes back to lesson 3.6. He's constantly going to war to expand France's territory. We think the Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, War of Spanish Succession.
And in the last video that we talked about, or the notes that we did, we talked about the American Revolution and the 7 Years' War. Those are also things that caused France to go into a lot of debt.
Yep. And all this debt is just accumulating and accumulating. So when King Louis XIV is no longer in power and we eventually get King Louis XVI, well, France is still in all of that debt. So what is he going to do? We'll find out. Meanwhile, there's a lot of bread shortages going on in France. So by 1788, the famines had made bread really scarce. Many people are going hungry. And then again, these are the third estate, not the first and second. And then lastly, the extravagant spending of King Louis XVI and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, pictured over there on the right. So Marie Antoinette was known for having a lavish lifestyle, which directly clashed with the massive amount of debt and the struggles of the French people. Right? Again, 97% of the people have a hard time feeding themselves, especially with the bread shortages. So this is going to cause a lot of doubt. The monarchy is serious about taking care of its subjects and its state. No one's really happy.
So, seeing all of these issues, King Louis XVI tries to call the Estates General in 1788 to have a meeting, to have a discussion. However, it's a little, too late, and revolution is gonna begin. So here's the spark that starts the revolution, right? So, like we said, 1788, King Louis XVI calls the Estates General, tries to figure out all this debt, tries to tax his people to alleviate the debt. Okay. The last time the Estates General was called was in 1615. That's 174 years without being used, right? Because Louis XIV did not call them a lot, right? So, unlike Louis XIV, who was an absolute ruler and didn't even think about calling the Estates General, Louis XVI was a little bit more timid. He's a little bit more willing to cater to the nobles and the clergy. And so that's why he wants to call the Estates General. So he calls them he calls them, and in June 1789, they meet. The Third Estate complains about that they don't have enough representation, like we've been talking about. There's 97% of them, but they only have, this a third of the power. Okay. That the taxes, they're also upset the taxes are only going to apply to them because the First and Second Estate, the nobles and the clergy, are exempt from taxes, which is, crazy to the Third Estate. And that the first two estates did not have any interest in trying to solve this problem or this burden of the taxes or of the hunger of the bread issue, right? Because it doesn't really impact them. So Third Estate super upset. They're not being heard, and so they kind of walk out of this meeting in protest.
It's also important to note that even though the Third Estate did have a third of the vote, right, each of them getting one, the First and Second Estate rarely differed in the way they voted because they have similar interests and values and their privileges. So it almost always was the First and Second Estate versus the Third in any type of vote, which meant the Third would not win. So let's keep going with this spark. So the next Estates General, the Third Estate's going to try to go, but think back to what Mr. Johnson just said. They had just walked out of the previous meeting, so they were denied entry into this current Estates General. So the Third Estate and some enlightened other estate members, as well as we mentioned, went to a nearby tennis court, and they are going to swear what's called the tennis court oath. You need to know this. This is a promise to each other that they wouldn't leave that place until they drafted a new constitution for France, which eventually ends up creating the National Assembly. In this new National Assembly, it's one kind of ruling of everyone's equal, everyone's coming together as one estate, not three different estates. It's this new governing body of France. So it's pretty much the Estates General, new name, equal representation, like fair representation. In this, the Third Estate people are going to declare themselves the one true body of France, and they're going to immediately grant themselves the power over taxation. Remember, because taxation is one of the biggest causes of this revolution. So Louis XVI is actually kind of forced to accept this since the vast majority of its people are a part of it. Secretly, though, he was not happy. He's not in favor. So he's going to start trying to secretly assemble an army to crush the National Assembly. Well, in doing so, his secret plot was discovered by the former Third Estate. So then we have a rebel group of people, the Sans-Culottes, what they're called, are going to storm the Bastille, another major event in 1789. And the Bastille it's an armory, it's a prison. It's a symbol of the king's power and tyranny of, again, King Louis XVI. So when they raid it, they release prisoners, they take weapons, they beheaded the mayor. This really is going to show how much anger and frustration all of these other people have, right? These commoners. This is the very first real uprising of the French Revolution, and this is kind of the final spark, right? The end of all of it. In the painting on the right here, by Jacques Louis David, the Tennis Court Oath, this was painted after the fact. We see three men in the middle. You see that, the one in white, brown, and dressed in black. They're shaking hands, and they're representing the union of all three estates into one group of people. So it's a pretty famous painting.
So, with all these sparks, the French Revolution has officially started. And in general, the revolution is thought of in two different phases, the liberal phase and the radical phase. All right, so the first phase we're going to talk about is the liberal phase. So essentially what this phase is about, it's about people gaining more power, and they're going to establish what's called a constitutional monarchy. So how do they do this? Well, 1789, the National Assembly is going to draft the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. And what this does is it guarantees the natural rights of people. It guarantees them freedom of speech, resistance of oppression. Okay, kind of sounds like the American Bill of Rights, right? So that's kind of, we're getting some ideas similarly here. All right, and then further on in 1789, there's a night called the Night of August 4th, and this is when the National Assembly calls an emergency meeting. And at this meeting, they abolish all hereditary privileges of the first two estates. So the fact that your privileges passed down from who your family is not going to be there anymore. So they eliminate any seigneurial duties, and they eliminate any hunting rights. Like the nobles couldn't have their own court privileges over the peasants. So they're trying to create more equality under the law.
I just want to mention here too with the hunting. Hunting was really big for the third estate because while they were starving and they had no access to bread and they couldn't even afford food, they weren't even allowed to go and hunt to try to get food from nature, right? So abolishing that was huge for the third estate in terms of equality.
So continuing on with this night of August 4th, after they abolish these privileges, they do grant Louis XVI the title of Restorer of Liberty. So this is an effort to try to appease him, to try to make him look like he's doing the right thing. But in general, right, this is creating a representative government, which is called a constitutional monarchy. So there's still a king, right? Louis XVI is still the king, but he's pretty much a figurehead. Okay, so it removes his veto power over the National Assembly, and really all the power is being held now in the National Assembly, in the people. All right, continuing on. 1 year later, in 1790, they passed what's called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, and this nationalizes the Catholic Church. So before this, the Catholic Church had all its own land, they had their own rights, their own laws, like they could kind of run the show. And now the clergy needs to follow the laws of the land, right? So the church's lands are going to get confiscated. They're going to eliminate the tithe, which is a tax that the peasants had to pay to the church. So that's going to be eliminated, give a little bit more financial freedom to the peasants. And the clergy are now placed under the authority of the state, right? So they have to take an oath of loyalty to the government. The clergy are not on their own anymore. The clergy and the church are beneath the state.
All right, so then let's look at these two pictures. So we've seen this one on the left before in this slideshow. And on the bottom, we have the third estate. We have the first and second estate literally living off the backs of the third estate. Well, now, after the revolution's kind of starting to begin and they're changing things, look at the picture on the right. We have the third estate on the back of the first and second estate. We have a couple of things I want to mention. Liberty, equality, and fraternity are the blue, white, and red. We see those colors a lot more in the right image than we do on the left. Hunting rights represented. So look at the third estate holding a rabbit, right? A dead rabbit on the sword. It represents the ability of all peasants and commoners to feed themselves. Then we have a balance and scale in the lower right in the second image, and that's going to represent equality between the estates, right? All estates are one now and not three separate. And then lastly, the sword itself actually represents the transfer of power to the third estate, to the commoners, rather than the first and second. So pretty cool differences in these two images, and they symbolize the revolution really well.
All right, so we're going to continue on with the liberal phase now, which is again all about how people are gaining more power when they establish that constitutional monarchy. So the next event we want to talk about is pretty cool. It's called the Women's October March on Versailles in 1789. All right, so women are especially angered by the bread shortages and the extravagant spending of Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette. So thousands of women march in the pouring rain in Versailles, and they demand that their king and his wife are going to give them bread so that they could eat again, right? And that they're going to basically, they think that the king and his wife, have all this food, they're hoarding all this food, and so they want all the food, right? And so King Louis the 16th, his wife, they say no. Okay, so what do the women do? They storm the castle, they kill the guards, they put their heads on pikes, they started towards the king to try to kill him. But to save his own life, King Louis XVI accepts the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And so this is a document that, even though it doesn't really represent women's rights, it is going to eventually come about when Olympe de Gouges would write the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen, which fought for the rights of women in France, which does slightly improve the legal status of women, like, for example, being granted as a citizen. even though eventually that gets revoked too. But the idea here, right, is that even though maybe women are not getting all their rights, they're fighting for the rights of everybody. They're standing up for the rights of everybody. So this is kind of a big turning point, and they forced Louis XVI again to accept that Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, to accept the new power of the common people.
Okay, so we've seen up until now that people have gotten some rights, right? The majority have gained rights, they've embraced Enlightenment ideas, but now we're going to enter the radical phase of the revolution where, okay, so people have these rights, but now they're going to take that power a little too far, a little too radical. So by 1790, the National Assembly had broken up into factions. I kind of think of factions in my brain as almost like political parties. And one of the more radical ones was the Jacobins. And the Jacobins, we'll see, are going to end up taking over control. So in 1792, the entire National Assembly voted to dissolve itself, and they're going to become a more permanent parliament called the National Convention. Kind of the same thing, different name. But this time, the Jacobins are going to seize control of the convention, and they're going to implement a set of radical policies that they want, right? They're the more radical faction. So let's look into some of their policies. First, they're going to fundamentally reorder time by declaring that year one is now 1792. It's going to be called the Era of Liberty. No longer is year one the year of Jesus' birth. It's 1792. They are also going to fix prices and wages to try and help the economy. But the thing is, people at this time wanted more economic freedom, right? More laissez-faire economy, less government control. So they're not really matching the needs of the people here. They're also going to attempt to make a 10-day work week calendar instead of a 7-day one. It doesn't last long. There's got some weird changes going on here. And then they're going to dissolve the constitutional monarchy, which think back had been established by the National Assembly. And they're going to move into more of a republic, right? A group of people representing the entire country rather than being more representative. And then lastly, this is huge. King Louis XVI is actually going to be beheaded, and France is going to be declared a true republic. And this happens by a vote of one. So the National Convention is going to have a vote what to do with the king. Do you behead him or not? And 361 yeas versus 360 nays. So literally one vote caused the death of the king. So he was publicly executed. We'll talk about the guillotine as well later on, but he's using the guillotine, publicly executed, and a lot of people show up. This is an image on the right of it. Well, painting of it anyway. So this leads to immediate opposition against the Republic, because if you look at 360 to 361, nearly half the population still was okay with the king and the king's role. So we're going to see a little bit of divide here and people thinking, all right, well, things are getting a little crazy. We're going a little too far.
Continuing on with this radical phase of the French Revolution, when this happens, neighboring countries start to get very afraid, right? They're like, oh my gosh, this kind of stuff could happen to me. The rebellion that's going on in France is going on. And, why can't this happen to us? So they try to limit the news of what's going on in France by getting out. They want to kind of suppress the National Assembly and what they're saying, okay? So in 1792, the War of the First Coalition begins. It starts in 1792, ends in 1797. And this war is between major European powers and counter-revolutionaries that are people against the French Revolution because of these ideas they're spreading, like taking away some power from the monarchy and having too much people being rising up for their own privileges. So people are trying to put a stop to this, right? Other countries are. And then we have this situation, Austria, Prussia versus France, where Marie Antoinette basically privately encourages her brother, who is actually the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, to invade France as a way to counter this revolution. So French nationalism from the revolution is at an all-time high, right? And so as a result, even though the queen is actually asking for her own country to be invaded, the Austrians and the Prussians get defeated on September 20th in 1792. And on the same day that National Conventions meets, that's when they abolish the monarchy and establish the republic, right? So there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes where the king and queen are trying to, solve this problem before it gets out of hand. But in the 1793s, basically, like we said, when they beheaded King Louis XVI, it terrifies all the other people. We just have the king being beheaded. They're worrying about the same thing happens to them. So they feel like they need to ally against France. And this new threat of neighboring countries and growing unrest against its own people basically is freaking out the new National Convention, the new government of France. And they're worried that the gains in their revolution basically are at risk, that they're going to be taken away. And so, in order to regain control, the National Convention is actually going to suspend all these new rights. They're going to suspend the Constitution that they just came up with, and they put into place something called the Committee of Public Safety, which is pretty interesting, pretty crazy. Okay, so the Committee of Public Safety is like a militaristic style of government called a tribunal that makes all the decisions. So even though all these people just worked so hard to give all the power to the people and like take away the power from the government, when things get out of hand and they're worried about their power slipping, that's when they go to this Committee of Public Safety. They go to this military style of government and they clamp down on any dissent from the French people. Okay. So this becomes known as
the Reign of Terror. But I want to mention too that the Committee of Public Safety, the National Convention says it's to protect the rights that we've gained so far. And while it doesn't, it hypocritically does the exact opposite. That was their use of like, all right, we're going to go a little extreme to protect what we've gotten so far.
sus.
Yep. So now we have the Reign of Terror. So this is led by a Jacobin named Maximilien de Robespierre.
Super important guy.
Know the name, no Reign of Terror. This is important. And he's actually himself and this committee is going to enact different policies. And we're going to go over a couple examples. So first, they're going to enact travel restrictions, which limits people's activities. Not fun. They're going to enact censorship. So anyone who speaks out against the Republic or against the revolution are going to be immediately arrested. No trial, no jury, arrested. There's mass conscription called Levée en masse. This is important because this actually gives France at this time the largest army the world has ever seen. Right? This conscription is going to deal with the full civil war that's going to end up resulting after the execution of the king, these external threats. Gives France a decent amount of power because of all the people. And the Reign of Terror and Maximilien de Robespierre used the guillotine to enforce these policies. The guillotine is a head-chopping device, right? So kind of pictured on the right here, a little bit blurry. But a big knife of sorts gets chopped down, heads fall off, and this is all public execution, not really private. So over 40,000 people are going to be guillotined. So they have their head chopped off. It becomes a symbol of evolution or equality of all people are being executed in the same manner and a lot of bloodshed. So again, you're weirdly using Enlightenment ideas here of equality, but because of death. So it's a little weird. And then in 1794, this abuse of power is going to anger a lot of people. Obviously, they're seeing people are beheaded, some of them for no reason. And some members of the Committee of Public Safety are going to actually end up beheading Robespierre himself in 1794.
Damn.
He just went too far, too crazy, and the people just had enough. Even his own committee went against him. So then a year later, in 1795, there's this thing that's important, and we'll kind of cover it a little bit more when we talk about Napoleon, but it's the creation of the Directory. And this officially ends the revolution and restores order because people had just had a crazy couple years where all these changes are happening. People are getting beheaded. They want stability. The Directory comes in. It's like, we'll give you that. We'll give you stability. It's a governing 5-member committee of the Republic of France. They try to balance the goals of both sides, right? You have the radical side. You have the more liberal side, more the Enlightenment side, all of them trying to appeal to the people. But what we're going to see is that Napoleon eventually starts as a member of the Directory. He is going to become leader of the Directory, what's known as First Consul. And this officially ends the French Revolution. So here we go. We're going to talk about the similarities between these two. So take a minute and read what Robespierre has to say on the left. And in this, he is justifying the use of terror and violence through Enlightenment principles. We talked about the hypocrisy of it in the last couple slides. And then on the right, we see an image of Maximilien de Robespierre executing the executioner. So again, we're going to see these two. Similarities are they're both emphasizing the use of violence to preserve the Republic, right? The light of truth is shining at the top. Robespierre is the main subject of both, but the huge difference is the commentary that France is going too far. Right? On the right, France is going way too far. On the left, Robespierre is like, nope, we're doing this for right reasons. You might see these again on either DBQs or stuff going forward. So these are historical developments. I know this was a long video. We really, really need to know it. Thank you all for watching. Shout out to our AP Euros kids, and we will see you all on the next video elaborating on the effects of the French Revolution.
Until then, bye.